G'day, ZiggyD here, and today I want to share with you guys my thoughts and analysis on the new Path of Exile skill development blog on Vigilant Strike and the Fortify buff coming with the Act 4 expansion pack. So for a very long time, Melee has been asking for and needing a couple of things. One is offensive skills, so attacks, or other skills that Melee can use that have inherent defensive bonuses to them, so that have like kind of a dual purpose of either dealing damage and providing defensive bonuses, or offensive utility with some defensive bonuses as well. So kind of tying in some defensive things into some of the mechanics of Melee. The second thing that Melee has been asking for and potentially needing for a long time to help sort of close some of the gap between Melee and sort of help them deal with the fact that in Path of Exile, Melee range is very, very dangerous for a lot of things. The second thing that they've kind of been needing is some across-the-board damage mitigation. Quite a few different action RPGs have this, where the Melee classes usually have a damage mitigation. It could be just across the board 30% damage mitigation, for example. They just take 30% less damage than ranged characters. And this is just like kind of a simple way of help sort of solving the problem that these guys are by default taking the majority of the damage. Now, Path of Exile had a bit of a problem in that because all characters share the same skill tree and the same skills and everything like that, and they can all sort of be, it's just so much more flexible and open in terms of how you can build your characters. You couldn't just give like the duelist 30% damage mitigation or 25% damage mitigation, because you would just play like a bow duelist and be super tanky, and so on. Like, all of the classes can play ranged and all of the classes can play melee. So that wouldn't really work. So this skill development blog details a new skill, Vigilant Strike, and a new buff, Fortify, that will be incorporated into this skill and into some other aspects in the game. They mention a support gem that will be able to be linked to melee skills. And I have to say, ZiggyD have done a great job with this, because they've nailed everything that Melee kind of needs in this area. There's still going to be, this is not like the cure, this is not the magic bullet for Melee to make all of a sudden Melee is going to be perfectly even with ranged, and it's going to be an even 50-50 choice which style of play you go for. But this is certainly going to help with at least the defensive aspects of the builds, while also providing some interesting extra builds as well through this skill Vigilant Strike that I think the design is fantastic of. This skill, just by itself, even ignoring the potential for the buff to be applied to support gems as well, this skill nails the attack skills that have a defensive bonus, and it nails the across-the-board damage mitigation without it being something that ranged characters can abuse. Well done, ZiggyD. That's really well done. I love the design of this. So let's click on over and we'll talk a little bit more about the skill mechanics specifically and how it works and how it comes together. Okay, so here is the skill. I'll link this blog post in the description for you guys in case you haven't checked it out. I'm not going to read through the entire blog post. You guys are quite capable of doing that yourselves, I'm sure. But I will go through the skill and the design of it, and we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics. So the skill allows you to do one powerful melee attack with, I think it has a 4-second cooldown. It has a cooldown associated with it. Yeah, 4-second cooldown, it says on the tooltip there. So the idea is that this is a big powerful hit. As you can see, it deals 165% of base damage. That's a huge hit. It's a huge hit. But of course, you can only use it once every 4 seconds. So just by itself, just slapping on a character, it's not like a viable skill for your only single target, or your only AoE if you put melee splash on it or something like that. With that cooldown, you can't just straight up use this, but you can incorporate it into a rotation. You can use it as an extra skill. So if you're using Heavy Strike as your main single target skill, you can potentially chuck a Vigilant Strike in there every couple of swings. Now the second part is that this skill cannot be evaded, so this is very nice for some builds that will be able to use this. It's an interesting choice. In the blog, they mentioned that they added this because they wanted it to be a very reliable way of getting the buff that this skill gives. So that makes a lot of sense. Having it not miss, if you're not playing a Resolute Technique character, is probably a pretty good idea for the purposes of this skill. It's a very nice bonus for the skill, though, if you're going to be building around this. And then you get the 100% chance to fortify on melee hit. Now, if I scroll up here, you'll see this is the what we can only assume is the fortify just here. Here's the skill and buff effects that he created, giving the skill a radiant theme. So it says this is to do with the skill, but this could be the actual fortify buff, the way the fortify buff looks. Whereas this looks more like the skill. You can see the fortify buff isn't here. You can only assume that appears just after striking the enemy. So that's kind of what I'm taking away from this. But this looks like what it'll be, the fortify buff. It seems like something like that. So, what does the Fortify buff do? The Fortify buff gives you a full 25% damage mitigation. It just reduces all of the damage you take by 1/4 across the board. All damage types. At least that's the way it seems from the blog post. Things could change, of course. This is in development skill and buff at the moment. So as we're saying, you know, this is something that will help close the defensive gap between melee, just giving them an across-the-board buff that they can take advantage of. Helps sort of counteract the fact that they're taking so much damage in the first place. So very nice stuff. And this skill, Vigilant Strike, provides that Fortify buff. Now, I don't believe anywhere in this post they mentioned the duration of the Fortify buff. I'm hoping and I'm fully expecting it to be not a long duration. I'm thinking something like 5 seconds maybe. I think 10 seconds would be pushing it. We have kind of a sort of a precedent of 10 seconds with charges. That's the core duration of the charges, but I think something like 5 seconds. You know, there's other skills like Blood Rage that have, you know, sort of like a 10-second sort of thing going on as well. So maybe it'll be 10 seconds, but I think 5 seconds would be fine as well. You know, 5 to 10 seconds, anywhere in that kind of works, though I would hope on the shorter end of the spectrum. Now, the reason for this is because I think 5 seconds rewards anyone playing melee using this skill. Now, a lot of people, when I was talking about this on stream yesterday, were saying, you know, you could just play a ranged character and weapon swap and then use this and get the 25% damage bonus. Or if you're playing Spectral Throw, you know, you're using a melee weapon, you can go in and use this and then get the 25%, and then it's buffing range. Here's my sort of counter argument to this. If you close into melee distance, hit an enemy with Vigilant Strike and get the Fortify buff, are you not a melee character? I think that's rewarding you for playing in melee. So the support gem that they've talked about in this post as well, that could potentially have the Fortify buff, they've kind of talked about the potential that you can link it to movement skills, so something like Leap Slam, for example. So you can Leap Slam in, get the Fortify buff, and then Leap Slam out. You could see that as a problem. I personally don't see that as a problem at all, because even if you're playing Spectral Throw, a ranged style character, you're still going into melee, you're still taking that risk of getting into melee by Leap Slamming a pack of enemies and Leap Slamming out. And if the buff is only 5 seconds or so, that's not really a problem. Now, this is going to come down to the time. If the buff is 10 seconds, then it is going to be like a very usable for someone like a Spectral Throw character all of the time to keep it up even when they're playing at range. So, you know, they can Leap Slam a single mob that's off by itself somewhere, have 10 seconds of 25% damage mitigation, which is very powerful. So I'm hoping it's a shorter duration for that reason. But overall, I feel like the design of this Fortify buff and the way it interacts with this skill and potentially the support gem is really, really good. It's something that, you know, weapon swapping on a ranged character, going into melee and using it, and then going out of range, it's not strong enough for that to be worth it. You know, you're better off just staying at ranged if you're playing a bow character or something like that. And if you are closing into melee, then I say that you've earned the buff. So that's my thoughts on the Fortify buff. It seems like a pretty fantastic addition to the game. I can't really see any major problems with it. As I said, I don't feel like it's abusable. Let's talk a little bit more about Vigilant Strike as a skill, because I actually think this is a really interesting skill. Now, firstly, it is, as I said, it's a long cooldown, or, you know, it's a cooldown-based attack, so it's not something you can spam constantly, with a high damage on hit, so 165% of base damage. Now, assuming nothing changes with fire proliferation, which there's a very good chance that those changes do happen in that area, but let's just say they don't, this skill would be a very nice fire prolif skill. Anything that hits big with a single big hit is a natural choice for a fire prolif skill. So you have that option. I'm sure you guys aren't cheering it, yeah, another fire prolif skill, but you know, it's one way that could potentially be built with it. And if they do rebalance fire proliferation in some fashion, but still make it sort of viable for this sort of thing, that could be some interesting builds that come out of this. I like the idea of this really beefy dude that runs in and just one strike something, just causing, you know, everything to burst in flames. I think that's a cool idea. It's just fire prolif's a little bit crazy at the moment. The second thing is, and this is the mechanic I haven't answered yet, and you guys go, but Ziggy, you can bypass the cooldown. Yes, we're getting to that. You can bypass the cooldown by expending an endurance charge. This is awesome. It opens up so many things. This is a big hitting skill, right? 165% of base damage. It's also got Resolute Technique built into it. You know what this is telling me? This is telling me you can do something like go crit maces, build stun. By virtue of having a ton of damage as well, you don't even really need to build too much stun, but just getting a little bit of stun and getting getting a crit multi, being a big heavy hitter with 165% base damage. You can use the support gem endurance charge on melee stun. Whenever you stun enemies, which is basically whenever you hit them, you're going to get an endurance charge back, and that bypasses the cooldown. It's kind of like playing Flicker Strike builds, where you constantly, you know, pinball around and kill things and get your frenzy charges and keep going around, and the frenzy charges feed in themselves and the skill feeds into itself. Thus, I can see the same thing happening here with endurance charges, and I think that's a really cool idea. It could be for some very strong builds potentially using this, using endurance charge and melee stun. Alternatives are you could use Warlord's Mark or some other, you know, a unique way of, you know, using a unique, I should say, of generate extra endurance charges. Anything that can keep your endurance charges up as you kill enemies will make this viable as a main skill or a powerful single target. Of course, you can link it to melee splash and multi-strike. I don't actually know about multi-strike. I assume multi-strike will work, and then you'll get 3 hits for the 1 cooldown, but we'll have to see how that works out. There's always kind of like interesting mechanics about those sorts of things. But it should work. I mean, multi-strike works on Flicker Strike, for example, so it should work. So there's some interesting builds that can be done there. Of course, you can just use, you know, Enduring Cry to build up a bunch of charges, and then use it as like a burst down a rare sort of thing. So if you have like 8 charges up, 8 endurance charges up, and there's a rare that you want to finish off, you know, you've killed the rest of the things with your AoE, which could be like Ground Slam or something like that, and then you run up and expend your 8 charges just to smash out some Vigilant Strikes, just insane burst damage, insane single target burst damage, and of course you get the Fortify. Alternatively, it can just be a skill that you use just to get the Fortify buff in your regular rotation for single target. You just attack an enemy with it every now and then. Honestly, I think when it comes to Fortify, most builds that aren't building around Vigilant Strike as a main skill will probably use the support gem. We don't exactly know what the support gem is going to work like yet, but it sounds like you can equip it to things like Leap Slam, and that's going to be like a great way of doing it, is linking that support gem to a movement skill, Leap Slamming in, get your 5 seconds or whatever, 25% damage mitigation, and then go ham with your other skills, which seems like the optimal way to play. But there's definitely going to be some interesting builds that come out of this Vigilant Strike skill just here. So those are my thoughts overall. I think very, very good design on this overall. You guys probably saw me talk about war cries and stuff like that in the podcast, and I thought there were some interesting ideas there, and I like the changes overall, but nothing that really blew me away. But the Vigilant Strike design and the design of Fortify, really, really top-notch stuff. It makes me really excited for the potential sort of, you know, rise of melee in Act 4. Even though I personally don't like playing melee that much, it'll be nice to see you guys get some love. Now, before we finish up this video, there was, of course, an Easter egg, and people would rage if I didn't show this off. There was an Easter egg in here somewhere. Here it is. ZiggyD likes to do this, right? Look at that little URL link just there. Don't worry, unarmed builds have got some other toys coming. So that's a plural as well, but here we have just this. Yep. Ah, yes, some unarmed love. I bet you guys are very excited about that. You know what I think is very interesting about this, though? I think that this is a new unique for unarmed builds. So besides face breakers, we're getting a second alternative to face breakers. Or sorry, I should say an alternative to face breakers. And do you know what I think this will be? Let's just take a look at this just here. Yeah, take a look at that. Yeah. There's a very curious similarity there. Now, I don't know, I'm not 100% on this. This is concept art, and this is, you know, in-game, but it seems kind of similar. Lightning on hit, you know, Touch of God is lightning damage. I'm seeing some similarities there. I'm thinking maybe the Marauder claims one of Dominus's gloves and decides to go beat down the denizens of Rayclass with it. Pretty exciting stuff. Alrighty guys, that's it for me. I'm ZiggyD. And thanks for watching.